Hello, Dr. and David Litwa. Welcome back to History Valley Podcast. Today we're talking about his book called How the Gospels Became History. The link to the book will be in the description below if you want to go purchase it. I enjoyed reading it, and I think all of you will enjoy it as much as I did. Okay, let's get right into it. What do you mean by the Gospels became history?
Well, first of all, hello, and it's great to have this opportunity to come back and clarify some of these issues about how the Gospels became history. The short answer is actually I didn't choose that title, but this is the only one of my books where the publisher just basically chose that title. But I've grown fond of it. I mean, in a sense, it's really not a matter of becoming history. It's a sense that the Gospels are all fairly late products written by elite or sub-elite writers who, because they were intellectual and educated, they had a sense of what was historiographically correct, and they could use historiographical tropes to explain what they were trying to get across. And so they are, in my opinion, and I just limit myself to what became the four canonical Gospels. But in my theory, which we'll discuss here, all four of those Gospels were intended to be read as historiography. And all four were using historiographical tropes. But as time went on, there was an increased use of those historiographical tropes. So there's a higher and higher register. So as we go from Mark to Matthew to Luke, all these being pseudonyms, but designating these Gospels as time goes on, they become more rather than less historical in their quality. But the most important thing to recognize here is that I'm not saying that the Gospels are history. I'm just saying that the Gospels are written in historiographical form, and they are intended to have you believe that they are historical. That is, that they are about events that truly happened in the past. The way that the Greeks talked about this is that a work is en historia schemati, that is, in the guise of history. But even a historical novel can be in the guise of history. A good example here being, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. I mean, conservatives and fundamentalists spent a good deal of effort trying to convince their own people that what Dan Brown was talking about wasn't historically true, but he certainly wrote as if it was historically true. And that's exactly how the Gospels are written as well.
Did Paul's letters become history like the Gospels do, or not necessarily?
Well, so just some background. So in my view, all the gospel writers, whoever they were fairly late. So late first, early second century. And they are all written by elites or sub-elites, and they are all written intentionally in narrative form, and all make use of historiographical tropes. Paul is not writing a narrative, and he is writing not high literature or what would be considered high literature. He's writing what might be thought of as documentary epistles or simply letters that were dictated off of the cuff. Now, that's not to say that there isn't some rhetorical sophistication in these letters. There is. And it's not to say that there isn't some theological depth to these letters. There is. But it is to say that they aren't written as literature. And so the kinds of tropes that Paul uses are going to be different. And in terms of the literary production, Paul's epistles are in a different literary world than those documents called the Gospels. So Paul, I don't think, is intending to present a historiography of Jesus. In fact, he seems to assume that all of his readers know who Jesus is, and that's why he says so little. And I think that, some people might think that, well, he says so little because he doesn't know much or he's making it up as he goes along. But I don't think that's the case. I think he's assuming that his readers all know Jesus, that they all know that Jesus existed, and that is the assumption of the letters. And so he doesn't need to argue that point, and he is content to merely make passing references to Jesus and his historical life. But when you get to the Gospels, the Gospels are best compared with literature like the Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Philostratus, and biographies that we find in Plutarch. And this sort of literature is of a higher register, in which talks about individuals which were also assumed to exist historically. But in the case of Plutarch, and why it's so important to compare Plutarch, is Plutarch also deals with figures that we in the modern world would consider to be mythological. So Plutarch writes a life of Julius Caesar, but he also writes a life of Theseus and a life of Romulus. And so the modern person might scratch their head and say, well, is Plutarch confused? Because clearly one of these, Romulus is mythological, whereas the life of Julius Caesar is he's not mythological, he's historical. Or, Plutarch also wrote about any number of Roman emperors and of great Greek generals like Demetrius Poliorcetes. I mean, is Plutarch confused? Well, I think actually it's we who are confused, because Plutarch assumed that everyone he wrote a biography about was historical. And this is the general presupposition in the ancient world. And I can't hammer this point home enough. They assumed there was a historical Heracles or Hercules, a historical Romulus, a historical Theseus, okay, just as a modern fundamentalist believes there was a historical Abraham and a historical Adam and a historical Enoch. So what to us might look like mythology, to them was historical, and what Plutarch realized, however, I mean, he was an intellectual himself. What his theory was that, for instance, in the case of Theseus or Romulus or Heracles, that their lives were historical, but that they had been mythologized. And so Plutarch's goal was to present the lives of Romulus, Theseus, and we don't have his Heracles, but it's the same principle, to present their lives as historical, or en historia schemati, and to use the tropes of historiography to bring these so-called mythologized figures back into the sphere of historiography. And my thesis in the book is that the gospel writers are more or less doing the same thing with a more recent figure whom non-believing Greco-Roman people would take as a somewhat a mythologized figure. I mean, after all, he walks on water and turns water into wine and does other fantastical tales, or does other fantastical deeds and undergoes fantastical things. And the point of this is that what is fantastical to some people is not fantastical to others. And what is being assumed is, for Plutarch, he's trying to remove, in some sense, this veneer of the fantastical. And the gospel writers are also trying to do that on some level without completely getting rid of it. Okay. And that's why I say that they're writing something like not historicized mythology, but actual mythic histories. And there's a slight difference there in that they are intending to write a form of history, but they realize that they can't quite get rid of all of what would be considered mythic elements, but they're still trying to appeal to elite and intellectual readers like Plutarch, who is, for his own heroes, able to see that, if you write it in the correct way, the life of Romulus is just as historical as any other life.
How would you analyze which parts of the Gospels are more reliable than other parts? And would you say that since Mark is the earliest of the canonical Gospels, should Mark therefore be regarded as the most reliable of the Gospels, or should we not look at it that way?
Yeah, my sense is that you should not look at it that way. In a sense, all of the Gospels are as equally removed from the events as any other. So if you think, for instance, that Mark is written 40 years or so after Jesus' death, in the aftermath of 70 and the destruction of the temple, well, it's sort of like, somebody sits down today to write the life of, Dr. Martin Luther King or someone like that, someone who lived in the 60s, maybe the 70s. And we have to imagine a world in which there's no documentation, like there's no pictures or newspaper articles, or there's no, reports from people, witnesses. There's nothing that looks like, people were actually trying to take down, like stenography, Jesus's speeches. There are no journal entries about Jesus. So when Mark or whoever, I mean, we just call him Mark, okay? But when whoever wrote this gospel that we now call according to Mark, okay, because of that fundamental lack of documentation, he is in a sense just as distant from Jesus as Matthew or Luke or John writing 20, 30, 40 years after that. I mean, the documentation isn't actually better in 70 than it is in 120. Okay, because there is no documentation. Now, now you will find in some conservative circles people trying to convince you that, you know, the first century Greco-Roman world, you know, was an oral culture and that the disciples were these fantastic memorizers. And some of this, I mean, is based on, say, rabbinic literature, you know, as late as the Babylonian Talmud, which is 6th century, okay, so 500 years after Jesus, in which it was the case that in Babylon, disciples of rabbis would attempt to memorize the bon mot, the sayings of their teacher. But it would be completely inappropriate to take that evidence from 6th century Babylon and then transfer it to 1st century Galilee. I mean, there's no reason to do that, okay? And in fact, that would break every law of history. It would be sort of like me, you know, wanting to write the life of Abraham Lincoln, and in order to help me out, I use information that is from the life of Martin Luther in, you know, 16th century Germany. And then I apply that to 19th century America. And I say, well, you know, they're both Christians of a sort. You see how irresponsible that kind of historiography is. It's all based on hope and wishful thinking. You know, a lot of the historiography that you'll find even in modern times, even still going on today in the 21st century, is apologetic historiography. It is trying to convince you that there is some kind of magical accuracy of the Gospels, even though there was no documentation and there's no evidence of mass memorization. And even the statement that, you know, the 1st century was an oral culture is in some sense wrong-headed, because yes, not everyone could read and write, true, but it was still a literary culture and a literate culture in the sense that about 10 to 15% of the population would have known how to read. And if you didn't know how to read or write, you would hire someone else to do it for you. It was a highly documented society with lots of high works of literature and poetry and historiography. And, you know, the way that Roman emperors still got their message across was by edict that was published in the marketplace. And you're expected to know it. So even if you're illiterate, somebody reads the message for you, usually some kind of herald. But that all the laws are, you know, written down. The culture is a writing-based culture. And that's why, you know, we have thousands and thousands of papyri. And it's why we have so much of literature that survives from that era, despite the fact that probably 80 to 90% perish. So I think, you know, it's rather a hopeful, rosy picture and based on wishful thinking to think that, oh, well, because Mark is the earliest, he must be historiographically the best. In fact, in terms of the historiographical tropes, Mark is the worst. And he's the most, although he is a sub-elite writer, he's the most, and when you compare him to someone like Luke, you see that he is not very careful to present the open historiographical elements of Jesus. When you open Luke, you see this wonderful historiographical preface in which he goes on and he says, I've done my research. I know many people have tried to write a life of Jesus, and I've got the best one because I know my stuff. And then he gives you like this historical background, and with the birth of Jesus paralleled with the birth of John the Baptist, and he includes all these poems and all of these songs and all of these long speeches, okay, which is exactly the sort of historiographical tropes you will find if you open up Herodotus or Thucydides, okay? These guys were composing the speeches and presenting the historical background and writing these complex prefaces and, dating things by ruler and saying, this happened when so-and-so was Archon of Athens or something like that. That's exactly what Luke will do, like in the so-and-so year of Julius Caesar, or in the, or Caesar Augustus, and in the 15th year of Tiberius, and, when Pontius Pilate was, and yada, yada, yada. That's all a historiographical trope, okay? Trying to root you in certain dates in history, which Mark doesn't do, okay? So you see, as time goes on, there's more and more of an effort to locate things in historical time. Now, that's not to say, okay, one must always distinguish the literary quality of writing something in history, writing something historiographical, that is, with all of these tropes of historiography that you would find in Herodotus and Thucydides. One must always distinguish writing in those tropes with actually writing history. That is, in things that happened in the past. We all don't have access really to things that happened in the past. And you can pick up Herodotus and Thucydides and say, I don't believe half the stuff they're talking about. In fact, even Herodotus doesn't believe in half the stuff he talked about. He's always saying, I heard this, but I don't believe it. Or I heard this, and judge for yourself. That is a great indication that even if someone is writing in a historiographical way, they're not necessarily, writing about things that actually happened. And we in the modern world, we're obsessed with trying to determine what things actually happened. And we're constantly frustrated. Well, on the one hand, we're fooled, because most Christians will pick up the Gospels and say, well, this sounds sort of like a, history. This sort of sounds like a biography of a real dude. And therefore, it must be telling about events that actually happened in the past. And the mistake there is, well, it might sound like history, but that doesn't mean that it is about events that happened in the past, just like, the Da Vinci Code or any other historical novel, But then there's also the mistake that, on the other side, people in the many of them in the atheist community become hyper sensitive and say, well, none of this stuff actually even looks like history to us anymore, because it's got miracles and all sorts of things, walking on water into wine. And I mean, who would believe this? Resurrection? I mean, come on now. That's a bunch of baloney, basically. And therefore, they also say, well, this can't even be intended to be written as history. And the mistake there is to confuse your modern sense of what a history or a biography should look like with what the ancients read. And what I really advise everybody to do, if you really want to understand what the Gospels are doing in their own time, is to go and read Plutarch. Plutarch's biographies are contemporary with the Gospels, and they are written in a very similar way. Or read the biographies of Suetonius, the lives of the Caesars, and see that they are written in a fairly similar way. And see what to a Greek or Roman author was or was not plausible, right? So to us, certain things are plausible. We're not prepared to believe certain things, like a guy multiplying bread in a field. But then you turn over and you read, or we're not prepared to believe that a guy can exorcise demons from somebody or raise a little girl from the dead. But then you turn over to Apollonius of Tyana and Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana, and you see that, well, some of the things he does are fairly similar to Jesus. So at least one very sophisticated Greco-Roman author, namely Philostratus, wants us to believe that these things happened and intends for us to believe those things, even though we in the modern world just don't think that's possible. I mean, how can you have an exorcism if you don't believe in demons, right? So we've shifted so far into another universe, so to speak, that we're not even in tune with what was believable and plausible at the time that the Gospels were written. And it's really important not just to read the Gospels, but to read the things around the Gospels, like Suetonius, like Plutarch, like Tacitus, and to a certain extent, Josephus as well. And that will give you the sense for what ancients thought would sound historical. But of course, that's miles away from what actually happened. None of us have access to that.
Rex Profanus, thank you for the super chat, $4.99. Would you assume one point that there used to be a reliable history? If so, when would you think that would have been made obscured or became a lacuna?
Well, thank you, Rex. This is exactly follows through with Jacob's question, because I would assume that there was reliable history about Jesus if he was a bit more about Abraham Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln, who, is much more than 40, 50, 60, 70 years dead. We have journal entries, we have newspaper articles, we have written testimony about his life. We have his own speeches that survive from his own pen. Okay, so if I'm going to sit down in my study as a historian and write the life of Abraham Lincoln, I'm going to be going to archives in big libraries in Washington, D.C., and New York City. And I'm going to be digging and digging into this and trying to figure out what this guy actually said, what this guy wrote, what this guy believed, what this guy did on a daily basis. And because there's so much written down, it's because there's so much documentation, then I can reliably attempt to reconstruct his life, with the caveat that in the end, I don't know, because all I have is the sources. With Jesus, it is a completely different world. And you really got to let this sink into your minds. There's no journal entry of, James, the brother of Jesus, saying, confirming anything that you have in the Gospels. There's no recordings of speeches. There's no stenography. Jesus never wrote a single word that we know of, although the later church claimed that he did. It's completely false. And there's no evidence that people during the time were really making the effort to memorize things. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? Because you go to the Gospels and you compare something like Mark and John, and, the speeches what Jesus actually says. I mean, it sounds radically different. And there's a sort of illusion effect, right? When you read Mark, Matthew, and Luke, because you're like, oh, well, some of this kind of sounds similar, right? So maybe this is remembered and accurate memory? No, it sounds similar because it's all plagiarized, right? So Mark comes first, Matthew and Luke plagiarize Mark, reformulate, and publish, okay? Because there's no copyright in the ancient world, okay? So yes, it does sound similar for obvious reasons. The same reason it would sound similar if 3 of your students downloaded the same paper off of Google and just did some adaptation, trying to, make it sound better or more historical, or maybe put it in their own style, maybe improve the grammar and lengthen it. But it's still from that same source. And then the question is, well, is Mark based on memory? Why would you think so? You would have to believe in the church's mythology that, Mark is John Mark, who was related to Barnabas, who lived in Jerusalem with his mother and maybe was a disciple of Peter. But what's the evidence of that? It's in a 4th century history written by Eusebius, hundreds upon hundreds of years after any of this is written down. And it's all post hoc justification to support the accuracy of Mark. So no, I don't in any way support the historical accuracy of the Gospels because there's no documentation. And those who believe in Q, I know Jacob has a question on Q, and who cite sources like M and L and all these other things. I mean, where are these? Documentation means that you actually have these things in hand, right? And even if we had Q, would Q prove that this is like a tape recorded message of Jesus? No. I mean, I don't think Q ever existed. I don't think we need Q, but even if you assume that there was something like Q, a list of Jesus's sayings, maybe with a couple sayings of John the Baptist, would it be any more accurate? I don't have any reason to think so. Nobody had a tape recorder. Nobody was into memorization. It's just like the Gospel of Thomas. People sit down and write sayings of Jesus and ascribe things to him. And yes, absolutely, there might be some things that could go back to something that he said, like a parable. But wow, when you play the telephone game, things sure change after 40 years. And by the look of, manuscripts and how many changes are made, well, we don't have any real reason to say anything in the Gospels is an absolute historical fact. But by the way, I apply the same measure to Herodotus and Thucydides. All of their documentation has been lost or destroyed. So it's not like I'm more critical with the Gospels than I am with Herodotus or Thucydides. I read Herodotus and Thucydides with that same critical gaze. I mean, how did they know what they know? Well, when it gets right down to it, it's all a lot based on hearsay. And it ends up being this wonderfully beautiful product that sounds like history. But you can always ask, what if it's not? And there's not a lot of extra supporting evidence. There's no system of flying buttresses, which is going to support Herodotus. Herodotus is a great example because Plutarch and others actually criticized Herodotus because he was the biggest BSer of the ancient world, even though he's the father of history. So history or historiography is a form of fiction. It is a form of fiction that is supposed to be based on documentation, but sometimes it isn't. And then you bleed into the category of historical fiction. But all of this is on a spectrum. Hola, Robert. Nice to have you.
$2, Robert. So would you view the proto-gospel hypothesis, that these different proto-gospels with people like Delbert Burkett talking about that Matthew and Luke, like he thinks that Matthew and Luke didn't even copy canonical Mark. He says Matthew copied, I think it was Proto-Mark A, and Luke copied Proto-Mark B. And ultimately, the Gospels weren't interdependent on each other, but they were copying other proto-Gospels that he hypothesized. Or you have this Streeter hypothesis, which has additional hypothetical documents, not just M and L, but also things like the Antiochus document. What do you think of those?
Absolute hogwash. I mean, I could hypothesize that an alien, came to Earth and dropped off a bunch of documentation about Jesus's life, S and G. I mean, who's going to stop me? All of that stuff is scholarly mythology. Most of it very old 20th century, when German source criticism was in its heyday. And the fact is, folks, all we have are the documents that we have. And if anybody comes up to you and taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, from these documents that we have, I can reconstruct 5 other hypothetical documents which came before them, that to me is just 1 degree higher than science fiction. In good history, if you're going to be a good historian, you base it on what you know and what you can know and what is actually available. In that respect, historiography is more like science, because science says, show me the evidence. Okay? If you want to, cook up some hypothetical document, a pre this or a pre that, go ahead, I mean, write your fiction. But unless I have it, unless it's available, I wouldn't trust any of that material. Just as I wouldn't trust anybody who said, well, it's an oral culture, they must have remembered everything. Absolute hogwash. I mean, just a moment's thought will dissipate that. Just, an afternoon study in a library looking at memory studies and how human memory degrades after not just 40 years, but 40 minutes. And you'll see that all of that is baloney. All that we have is what we have. So go learn Greek, check out the manuscripts, okay? All this stuff is online. I mean, you don't even need to go to, divinity school to get access to any of this. I mean, the manuscripts are online, the Greek tutorials are online. Go learn Greek. Access the Gospels. That's all we have. It's all we have. Okay. Don't worry about these people who are, trying to sound smart and bring you up to speed on M and L and Q and S and Z and V and B1 and, whatever. We don't have any of that. Let's just do good history. And what I encourage people to do is read the documents that actually exist. Okay. So again, go read Plutarch, go Tacitus, go Josephus, go Herodotus, go Thucydides. All these you can get at Barnes & Noble, real cheap off Amazon too. Go read these people who actually said that they, were writing history, and then compare them with the Gospels. I guarantee you'll be surprised both by parallels structurally, not just in terms of content. This is the problem with mythicist comparison. They're trying to, they go anywhere to find a parallel. But one of the most interesting parallels are not, individual stories and words. The most interesting parallels are structural. What is an author assuming about how he's writing a product or how she's writing a product? How do you write in the ancient world as a historian? I mean, the ancients, they gave us history. They're the inventors of history. So instead of, looking to modern history and then comparing that with the Gospels, which, will wreak havoc in any comparison, go to the ancient historians, see how they wrote history, and then compare that with the Gospels. I guarantee you'll be surprised. I mean, there's a lot of really important overlap. And it's really important to, think like an ancient person rather than a modern one.
Dharma Defender, thank you for the $5. Would Dr. Litwa say that our New Testament is in the phylogeny of Gnostic writings, e.g., Paul, Mark, John, the Peter epistles, Hebrews, Colossians, etc.?
Well, I'm not sure what Dharma means by phylogeny. Gnostic writings are generally thought to be, first of all, let's not call them Gnostic. If you open up the Nag Hammadi library, okay, and you can also get that real cheap on Amazon, okay, you'll get all sorts of writings written by 2nd and 3rd century Christians. Gnostic, it doesn't really mean much as a label anymore, because all sorts of Christians, including in the New Testament, were claiming to have gnosis. In fact, that is exactly what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8. We all have gnosis. Of course, that's just translated, we all have knowledge. But gnosis is just a very fairly common word for knowledge. It appears all over the New Testament. It's in Ephesians a lot. Okay. And knowledge is very important for salvation, including in the New Testament. And this was a theme that was taken on in later Christian writings. And some of those were also intended to be read as historical. So you have Gospels in Nag Hammadi, and you have, Acts literature, and all that sometimes also is written in the guise of history as well, which is a completely different question than, whether any of it happened or not. So if I'm not understanding the question, Dharma, just send through a clarification, but that's my sense.
Dharma, thank you for the $2. View on synoptic problem, Q or no Q, what relation?
Well, my position is that we don't need Q to explain anything anymore, okay? But if you want to believe in Q, that's fine. But I'm a very practical and pragmatically minded person. You never die in a ditch for a document that doesn't exist, okay? And even if we had Q, it doesn't actually support the historicity of the Gospels. It would just be a list of sayings used by Matthew and Luke. It doesn't mean that those sayings are somehow magically historical or that they're based on memory. In fact, if we had Q, we wouldn't know when it was from. I mean, it would be very hard to date. And who knows? Who knows what the accuracy would be? So if you want to use Q to solve the synoptic problem, that's fine. I don't. I think it's perfectly fine to see Matthew using Mark, Luke using both Matthew and Mark, and John using everybody. And that explains 99.9% of everything. But if you like Q, run with it.
Rex, thank you for the $4.99. How many hours have you stayed up at night, wondering what could be found in the supposed Piso Villa, referred to as the Villa of the Papyri? Support.
Well, we actually have a lot from that Villa of the Papyri, and much of it continues to be translated. That was found several hundred years ago. It's an Epicurean library written by a famous Epicurean philosopher, or not written by him, but it was his own library that was carbonized in the explosion of Vesuvius in 79 CE. And we've literally had to, well, we can't decarbonize everything, but we've literally had to find some way to read these carbonized texts. And we're finally getting to the point where we can read a bunch of them. And so I encourage everybody out there to, look this up. You can Google the Via of the Papyri. You can Google the Herculaneum Papyri and see what's published. Some of it's on the internet, some of it's in academic libraries. It's an Epicurean library, and it's contemporary with the Gospels, and it's useful and fun stuff.
Myth Vision Podcast, thank you for the $5. Great guest, Jacob. What would Dr. Litwa say we can confidently know about the historical Jesus, birth, life, death?
Easy question, Derek. Absolutely nothing. But I say the same thing about Herodotus and Thucydides, right? I'm not biased when I come to the Christian historiographical writings. Now, the key word here, though, is confidently, right? And this is really important for historians. If you ever find a historian who's confident, like a rooster walking up the street and saying, "This definitely happened," that's probably not a historian, because that's not how we historians actually work. Okay? We know that things are based on evidence, and we try our best not to make that evidence up. Most of us succeed in doing that. So we work with what we have, but we confidently know nothing. Okay? And that's a very important Socratic principle. Socrates became this famous philosopher because he was the only guy in Athens who admitted that he knew that he did not know. And that's also the first principle of history, that we don't have a time machine or a video camera or tape recorder. We have written documents written on papyri that were supposedly written between 40 and 100 years after Jesus, and that our oldest copies were preserved 200 to 300 years after Jesus. And they're written by people who never claimed to be apostles, who never claimed to have known Jesus personally. All that is later church mythology. And that's what we got. So am I going to stand up here and say, "Oh, we can confidently know, a fly landed on Jesus's nose in Galilee, and that was the inspiration for the Sermon on the Mount"? Do we know that he sat down for the Sermon on the Mount? Do we know that there was a Sermon on the Mount? No. All we have are a bunch of sayings compiled by a guy who is now called Matthew, but falsely, who composed a sermon just exactly like Thucydides composed the speeches of Pericles. Okay? Did he have a tape recorder? Nah. Did he think that he got the gist right? Probably. Is there any reason to believe everything down to the letter? Nope.
What do you make of some scholars claiming that the Gospel of Thomas is early? Some even claim that it was written as early as the AD 50s. I think even some of them claim that Thomas was the Q document. What do you make of this?
Yeah, more wishful thinking, from a different side of scholarship. But there's no evidence. The only full, copy of the gospel that we have is in Coptic, that was probably written in the 4th century, and that refers to the permanent destruction of Jerusalem, which indicates that it was written after 135, when Hadrian had permanently expelled the Jews from their homeland. So not much confidence in that document going back to 50. And then we have Greek fragments from the very late 2nd and early 3rd century. And then, the Nicene preacher quotes the Gospel of Thomas and quotes it in a version which isn't even recognizable. But he says it's from the Gospel of Thomas. And we can see in the manuscripts there's quite a variation on where the sayings appear. So that would indicate that late into the 2nd century, this is a changing document. Changes every time it's written down. The only way you could get this document back to 50 is by a rolling corpus model. They say that, well, this saying, was written here in 50, and then there was an update in 70, and then there was an update in 100, and then there was an update in 130, and then in the 4th century it was translated into Coptic. But that's like creating a mountain based on stilts, because your only way to have a rolling corpus model is by your subjective intuitive opinion to say, this saying sounds like it must have been written in 50. Like, for instance, the James saying in the Gospel of Thomas 12, right? Go to James the just, for whom heaven and earth came into being. Someone who believes in the rolling corpus model will be like, well, that couldn't have been said in 130. That must have been said in 50, when James was still leader of the Jerusalem church. Baloney. There's a bunch of James literature written in the 2nd century in which he's still the great authority. And let's face it, nobody would say about James when he's alive that for him, heaven and earth were created. I mean, all of that is clearly later mythologizing, probably 2nd century. So, that kind of scholarship really isn't scholarship. That's worse by far than any hypothetical Q document. It's like creating documents, hypothetical documents on hypothetical documents, based on your own subjective opinion about when a saying could be said. It doesn't work.
Fire Sabers, thank you for the $5. Do you believe that we have enough evidence to support that John the Baptist is historical?
Yeah, I do, because we have the criterion. We have 2 things. We have the criterion of embarrassment, and then we have attestation of John the Baptist in other literature. Some of it not even Orthodox Christian. Okay, so like the Mandaeans, they love John the Baptist. Okay, and the Elkosites go back to John the Baptist. These are later Christian sects. And then the criterion of embarrassment is, let's face it, John the Baptist was an embarrassment to early Christians, because John the Baptist thought that he was, top dog. And Jesus came to him like a little puppy in order to get baptized. And later Christians were all embarrassed about this, because it looks like John is the alpha male and Jesus is like this lowly follower of John who gets dunked in the Jordan in obedience to John's message. And then all of a sudden, you have to depict him later as the Messiah, with John kowtowing to his baptizand. It all really doesn't make a whole lot of narrative sense. So because John the Baptist looks like was an embarrassment to early Christians who always wanted to say, well, yeah, Jesus did get baptized by John. He was a follower of John. He did get a lot of ideas from John, but in the end, he was better because he was the Messiah and actually God. You see, all of that is later, reverse engineering, post hoc imaginative constructions to make sure that Jesus ends up being better than John. And then they even invent sayings of John such that, I'm not worthy to touch his, to tie his sandal. I mean, is that historical? No. I mean, come on now. I mean, John is the guy in charge. He's not going to be kowtowing to Jesus. It's all wishful thinking to think that John even imagined that Jesus could be better than him or the Messiah. All of that was later Christian wishful thinking.
Could you describe the differences between the Gospels' different models of Jesus? Because I know you talk about things in the book like Matthew's model for Jesus.
Well, I'm not sure I refer to independent models, but the point of the book is just to like take you on a tour, okay, of other Greco-Roman literature, okay. So if you don't have time to slog through Tacitus or Suetonius or Plutarch or Philostratus, you can pick up my book. I'll give you the sort of grandstand version of who's writing what and why they're trying to sound like historiographers, like people who are writing events which actually happened but may not have. Okay, that's always the caveat. It might not have happened. Okay. So what I try to do is to show, based on comparison, why it makes sense to think that when the gospel writers or the evangelists sit down to create their products, that they want to sound a bit like Herodotus. Why do they want to do that? Because Herodotus, in his own time, is, Plutarch might make fun of him, but he's still hot stuff, and to write history, you got to be pretty smart and intellectual to do that. And if you want to be believed, of course, you want to write in such a way that people actually believe that what you say happened, right? Lucian talks a lot about this he has an entire book, How to Write History. And it's just an instruction manual. It's like, well, you want to be believed? Here's how you write history. Okay. Is he at all concerned about whether it really happened? No. And in fact, Lucian makes fun of this in his book, True Histories. He says, I was on a ship. It turned into a spaceship, and then I landed on Earth in the sea, and there were people with feet made of cork and the skidding on the water. And he's just making fun of you. I mean, he says in the preface that I'm going to write something that sounds like history, and not a word of it is true. Not a word of it. But that's the fun, right? Now, what the gospel writers are doing is they are writing for religious insiders. And in fact, religious insiders, namely Christians of all sorts, read this stuff every week in church, and they all think that it's historical, or the majority do, who haven't, given any time or thought to anything going on in scholarship. They, out of their own devotion to the literature, they read it as what really happened. And that's what gives motivation and power to their faith. It would ruin everybody's Sunday if, someone like me got up and said, guess what? Sermon on the Mount never happened, or Jesus never multiplied bread. I would soon lose my job as a pastor. I could, as a pastor, say, well, it's all a spiritual meaning, of course. But that's not my game. I'm not really interested in what the religious insider thinks of the literature. What I'm interested in is what the ancients thought of the literature. And that partially makes sense of why we still read it, why religious insiders still today read it as history. They're still following the intent of the gospel writers, but that doesn't mean it is actually something that happened.
Dharma Defender, thank you for the $5. Best guess, what was Christianity, and what did they want, believe, and come from? Like the usual apologetic story, or something else?
Well, that's really the fun of doing Christian history, because if I wanted to reconstruct, say, the church in Corinth about the year 50, I've got a letter from Paul, and that's about it. But you can take that pretty far. And certainly we have. If I wanted to find out, what Christianity was in AD 35 or 35 CE in Jerusalem, I've got basically nothing, because Acts is pure mythology. It's purest to the pure golden age, idealistic, rosy, written 100 or more years after 35. Okay. So that's pretty hopeless. And I've got to tell you, first of all, I wouldn't even call it Christianity at that time. It really becomes Christianity. That name is invented in the late first century. I mean, what we think happened was, yeah, this was just a weird sect of Judaism that kind of fostered in Galilee. And for whatever reason, there were recruiters who followed trade networks, and they started spreading this message about Jesus, who, probably wasn't, we don't know exactly what they said. And because we have no other information. So, yeah, I mean, I hate to sound disappointing, but this is one of the first, lessons of history. We do not know. We really don't know. And we need to say that. We don't know. And if anybody tries to twist our arm and say that they do know, you know that they are either lying or self-deceived. We don't have the sources. We just don't. Sorry. Get over it. And then let's start with our reconstructions. And you can go to any Christian library today and find a jillion reconstructions of what happened at that time. Take all of it critically. Look at the sources yourselves. Frankly, between 30 and 50, there are none. Sorry.
JH, thank you for the $4.99. Did the first Christians assume the Romans would erase Judaism from all memory in the War of 70?
Nope, not at all. In fact, the Jews, well up until the 130s, were hoping the Romans would sponsor the rebuilding of their temple. We see this in the Epistle to Barnabas. We see this in 4th Ezra. Certainly, it was shocking that the temple was destroyed in 70, but the Romans never actually, I think actually Josephus is right. The Romans never really intended to go in there and destroy Judaism as a religion. They just wanted, the cash and the crops. And it just so happened that the rebel leaders were hiding out in the temple. So it's no surprise that, they just went in and burned it. But there was no attempt to attack Judaism en masse. But that all changed with Hadrian in the 135. He began to see that the religion was something of a problem, that it was disruptive, because they were, creating messianic figures. And so he basically booted the Jews out, all Jews, out of their land in 135 after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And, so it's important not to read 70 in light of 135. Those are two very different events.
Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, thank you for the $5. Marcelina, Philomene, Helen of Alexandria, who are they? Why are they important?
Hi, Jason. So Marcelina, just written a book on her, actually. It's called Carpocrates, Marcelline, and Epiphanes. And I'll be podcasting about her on my Patreon. She's the only Christian leader, only female Christian leader of a group at Rome during the 2nd century. Immensely important. And Philomene is a Christian female prophetess, also probably at Rome, who apparently performed miracles. And Apelles, who was a Marcionite, wrote a book of her prophecies and sayings. Helen, I'm not sure what you mean by Helen of Alexandria, but Helen, Simon's Helen, was apparently a woman of Tyre who went around with Simon. And she apparently had some intellectual caliber of her own. Her followers were called not Simonians, but Hellenians. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about it, but don't believe the heresiologists who tell you that Helen was, just some kind of prostitute walking around. It's often that males who are threatened by female leaders will just call them prostitutes in order to defame them. And unfortunately, in the ancient world, there's nothing like a defamation trial. So these sorts of things get thrown around, which you can safely ignore. Thanks, Jason. I know that's very short, but join the Patreon. You'll find much more.
Final question. What do you think of scholars claiming that the Q doc. There's proof of the Q document in Papias of Hierapolis's fragments that he keeps talking about a logia being written by a Christian, possibly being redacted by other Christians, and that there was a sayings tradition.
Well, if you're depending on Papias to help you support Q, you're barking up the wrong tree, because Papias very clearly says, and all that we have of Papias is mostly quoted by Eusebius in the 4th century, so we're not getting him direct. But what we have of Papias is he says that he didn't care much about written stuff, that he always preferred what he heard from the living voice. And he would interview people who had supposedly known or been friends with, familiar with disciples who went back to Jesus. But, this wasn't like, this was like a chain of people claiming to know, like disciples of Jesus, like Philip and Andrew and people like that. We don't know what to make of those claims. We also don't know what they said. But nothing in Papias sounds like Q. And if he does mention logia, but and he does write an exegesis, as he calls it, of the logia of Jesus. But it definitely wasn't Q. And we have no idea what was inside it, because Eusebius thought that, and this is Eusebius' own language, he thought that Papias was a man of small mind, basically a dimwit, and he didn't agree with anything Papias said. So, well, he didn't agree with the content of what Papias wrote about, the majority of it, so he just didn't actually mention it or write it down, and nobody preserved the book. So there you go. I wouldn't, that's a crutch. There's a great book on Papias recently out. Stephen Carlson, you can pick that up. Oxford Early Christian Texts. Yeah, get up to speed.
Vision Podcast, thank you for the $2 super chat. What do you think about the Roman provenance theory?
Well, Derek, I'm not actually sure what you mean by that. Do you mean that Gospel of Mark was written in Rome, or that Christianity was born in Rome? I'm not sure. If you just want to send Jacob some clarification, I can approach that.
Well, I know what he's talking about. It's a theory that some people have that the Romans, the Roman government, organized and created Christianity, and pro-Roman Jews were writing, or particularly traders, and some people even think that Josephus was involved in the creation of Christianity.
Yep, it's not very likely, and I think anyone who's read, like, again, Suetonius and Tacitus and Cicero and Livy, actual Roman writers, you see that virtually all elite Roman writers despised small, translocal, mobile religious movements, and they referred to early Christianity as a disease and a superstition, and they weren't at all interested. Tacitus likens it to the sewer sludge that flows into the Tiber. He just considered it all filth. And that's pretty much the attitude of Romans well up until you get to Celsus. They just don't care. So yes, I would be very surprised by a Roman provenance of Jesus or of Christianity. But I will say that, it is true, I think, that Orthodox Christianity or early Catholic Christianity was invented and supported by Roman leaders, but that's in the late 2nd century, not the 1st.
Thank you for joining me once again, Dr. Litwa. And I thank all
Yep.
the people that super chatted. I appreciate the support.
Yes, thank you to everybody.
I'll be live streaming tomorrow. I'll be having 2 shows tomorrow, so keep an eye out for them. And thanks again, Dr. Litwa.
Thank you, and I hope everyone is enjoying summer in the northern hemisphere there. And I wish everybody well. And yeah, thanks for coming.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live